And we're online. Hello, good afternoon or good morning, depending where you're watching us from. My name is Maria Skora. I'm head of international dialogue at that Progressive Zentrum, a think tank in Berlin, which is committed to the progressive cause, to supporting progressive policies, be it in socio-economic transformations, future of democracy, or international dialogue. And I have the great honor and pleasure to welcome you to our debate today, co-hosted with the Foundation for European Progressive Studies in Brussels. The debate on which wants to answer the question, do we need a new progressive East policy or Ostpolitik? Of course, the context is the 50 years of symbolic gesture of Willy Brandt in Warsaw, and therefore I'm very happy to welcome great speakers who will tell us their reflections and their remarks, not only on the past, but also on the future. So welcome to Aleksander, Kwaśniewski, to Kati, Piri, to Liana and Max Bergmann from 4 capital cities. And on a very private note, if someone ever told me, the 11-year-old me, that one day I will be opening a debate with President Kwaśniewski, I probably wouldn't believe so. The more honored I am. Welcome. And thank you to everybody, all of you, for accepting our invitation. It's a live debate. You're welcome to tweet. You're welcome to ask questions. This is the request to all those viewers out there. And I would also like to invite Thomas Kralinski, who is the member of the board of das Progressive Zentrum, to also greet and welcome not only the speakers, but also the viewers. Thomas, are you with us?
Yes, I am. Dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. President. First of all, I would like to thank you for being here this afternoon and talking about an event that is already 50 years ago. And we're talking about an event that is so long ago and what it means for the future and what it means for us today. I'm quite sure everybody who is interested in politics or history in Germany and Poland and probably in other countries as well, certainly in Europe, knows this picture of the German Chancellor on his knees in front of the monument of the heroes of the Warsaw Ghetto. It became a very iconic picture. Maria said it already, because it was a very strong gesture of very deep emotions. It took place at the very same day as the West German government and the Polish government signed the treaty, the Warsaw Treaty. Egon Bahr, who was minister in Willy Brandt's cabinet and probably the architect, he was the architect of the so-called Ostpolitik, he named the Warsaw Treaty as the precondition of Poland's return to Europe. And that's why it was a very strong gesture of reconciliation. Just to remember, just 25 years after World War II ended. And I think reconciliation as well as cooperation is today as important as it probably never has been, because I think we're living in, I'm quite sure that everybody of us is quite aware of it, in times of conflict, of emerging conflicts in Europe and the world as a whole. What we see is the European social and economic model is under threat. We see democratic values are under threat, not also from our inside. We see rising nationalism and unilateralism, but I think what we have to bear in mind is, or basically 2 things. The first thing is that we're still living together on one continent. And if I say this, I'm not talking about the European Union only, but Europe as a continent. It's just pure geography. And the Polish border with the Ukraine or Belarus. And secondly, what I think we have to bear in mind is that we have similar challenges ahead in a more and more complex world. These are challenges of digitalization of everyday life in our economy, the future of mobility, of energy supply, of medicine, of resources and technologies, of climate change, of security. And all these topics, all these challenges are interconnected with each other. as well as our society. We have to find ways of balancing, of cooperation, of reconciliation between European neighbors. That means we have to listen and talk more about with each other. We have to listen to our history, about sort of a precondition for more peace and growth and wealth. And that's why I think some new form of Ostpolitik needed, an Ostpolitik of mental sort of responsibility and understanding. And these that's why I'm quite happy that we're here to talk about these perspectives, and I'm quite sure we're going to produce some very how this new Ostpolitik might look like. So the floor is yours now.
Yes, thank you very much, Thomas. So this is a very, very warm welcome on behalf of das Progressive Zentrum. But as I mentioned, this event is a co-production with our wonderful partner, FEPS, Foundation for European Progressive Studies. And I'm happy to welcome László, Andor, the Secretary General, and my dear friend and colleague, Ania Skrzypek. And then László, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria. Ladies and gentlemen, the Foundation for European Progressive Studies is a proud co-host, co-organizer, together with das Progressive Zentrum, of this important event. And it's indeed a great pleasure to see President Kwaśniewski and the distinguished panelists coming together today to remember Willy Brandt, who is a former leader of the German Social Democrats, but also a former president of the Socialist International, and in the meantime, Chancellor of West Germany from 1969-74, actually less than 5 years. However, Willy Brandt became an icon, a symbol of overcoming divisions between East and West Berlin, East and West Germany, and East and West Europe. And subsequently, after he stepped down as a chancellor, he also worked hard to overcome division between North and South in the world economy and world politics, together with his contemporary social democratic leaders like Olof Palme in Sweden, Gro Harlem Brundtland in Norway, Bruno Kreisky in Austria. A golden age of West European social democracy, I suppose. But today we remember an event that took place exactly 50 years ago, just a few moments after the picture behind me was taken. Visiting Warsaw, recognizing the German-Polish border along the Oder and Neisse rivers, Brandt went to the memorial of the Warsaw Ghetto and fell on his knees spontaneously. And this was an act of grief, decency, and responsibility. With the visit, and especially with the Kniefall, Brandt recognized German responsibility for the Holocaust. But we should not forget that the responsibility for the Holocaust does not fall on Germany alone. The Kniefall also became a symbol of German Eastern policy, or in German, Ostpolitik. But again, Ostpolitik was not invented in 1970. Brandt and Egon Bahr started to work on it as early as 1963. And today we can consider it as one of the most successful and progressive foreign policies in global history. However, Brandt's Warsaw visit was not at all about pleasing the incumbent communist leaders of Poland. Actually, Stanisław Gomulka, with whom Brandt met, had to step down in the same month because of the violent repression of the workers' demonstrations in Gdansk. And let me just tell you 3 more important facts at the end. This visit actually took place when Germany held the presidency of the Council in the European Community, a very interesting coincidence. The year later, Willy Brandt received the Nobel Prize for Peace. And in July 2007, the European Parliament inaugurated a building named after Willy Brandt, to which the European Conservatives and Reformist group moved in, which I find a little bit ironic. But with this introduction, let me invite our distinguished speaker, President Aleksander Kwaśniewski, to take the floor.
Thank you, dear friends. Thank you for interesting introductions. Please allow me to share with you some remarks, and the first one will be very personal, because when I see your faces, I understand that I'm among the very, very few witnesses of this event. Of course, not in person, but I was in this time 50 years ago quite matured person. I was 16, and I remember these days and this visit of Willy Brandt to Poland. And I want to say you that for me that is one of the crucial moments in my life and also political life. And I tell you why. Because you have to know that I was born in Białogard, Belgrade. That is former German territory. I was born in 1954, so only 9 years after the end of the Second World War. For us, maybe not so much for my generation, but especially for the generation of our parents, this situation was still very uncertain. So my parents never believed that this territory will stay as a Polish territory for forever. So this day, when the government of Federal Republic of Germany, when Willy Brandt and Walter Scheel decided to sign the border agreement with Poland, was really historical day. It was the signal and symbol that Germany finally is ready to accept this new situation, and we can be much more safe in our houses, in these places of the world. So the second, of course, because of communist propaganda, we didn't know a lot about this gesture of Willy Brandt. In some Polish newspapers, we had this picture, but in my home, my father listened every evening Radio Free Europe from Munich, and we had all this information and comments about this gesture of Willy Brandt. And I think this gesture was absolutely one of the greatest in the history of 20th century, because of course we had some discussions why in front of the monument of the heroes of Warsaw Ghetto, not in our place, in other places. But I tell you, in my opinion, this gesture in this place was absolutely great and correct, because if you know this monument in Warsaw, you can find on this monument that this monument is for the heroes, Jewish heroes, who fought for the rights of Jewish community, but they were fighting for independent Poland as well. And they were fighting for the humanity, because this uprising, this act of courage of these people during ghetto uprising had absolutely universal framework, had universal scale. So I think, and in my opinion, this gesture and I remember this gesture as a great gesture of reconciliation. It was asked for forgiveness. It was such symbol of German responsibility on the Second World War and everything what happened during this war. this gesture was done by the man who was not responsible politically for fascism, and everything was fascist decided. And this gesture was, first of all, such great wish for reconciliation, for this reconciliation between not only Poles and Jews and Germans, but also between all the victims of the war and New Germany led by Willy Brandt. So that is my first point. This gesture, this Kniefall 50 years ago, changed the history, and therefore we remember this gesture so well. And I think it's good that we organize this discussion today, because Willy Brandt and his gesture deserved for that. And the last such personal remark, I tell you why I am social democrat, and I was social democratic leader in Poland, because I had on my road two iconic personalities, and one of these personalities was Willy Brandt, and the second was mentioned before, Olof Palme. And I think for many people from my generation, the generation which today is 60, 70, something like that, these two persons, they encouraged us to go together, to be social democrats, and to try to fulfill democratic values in our life. Now, of course, Ostpolitik, I think it was one of the most important concept of politics in 70s and 80s. Willy Brandt was co-author of that, Egon Bahr, of course, yes. And this politics, of course, I think changed the world and changed Europe very much. And we can say that the 10th and then Helsinki Agreement in 75, and then some liberalization of regimes in Central and Eastern Europe as well. It was an element or consequence of this Ostpolitik as well. We know very well that this Ostpolitik was sometimes very strongly criticized by the people from opposition, from the democratic opposition in our countries. And I understand that for them, this real politics was something difficult to accept. But in my opinion, this very clever, very patient Ostpolitik really changed the situation and created the space where the changes, where the real reforms and also the change of power was possible. So in my opinion, understanding and knowing about all this criticism, I want to say that Ostpolitik was a good beginning for liberalization of politics in our countries, and then the changes which happened in 89, 90. And finally, Ostpolitik is one of the pillars of unification of Europe and enlargement of European Union in 2004. And today is a question how to describe Ostpolitik now. What we can do with this, let's say, new Ostpolitik, what is a subject of our debate today. I tell you, it's not easy to describe this new Ostpolitik. Why? Because first, the world changed very much. And we have generally absolutely new situation as Brandt had 50 years ago. Soviet Union collapsed. We have no longer such confrontation between ideological confrontation between communism and Western democracies. We have new independent states from Ostbloc, like Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, Caucasus, etc., etc. So the situation is really different. But if you want to, of course, I will speak in very general terms. We want to make this new Ostpolitik a little bit more concrete, I have some elements which I want to underline. The first, I think, why Brandt decided to make this gesture, because a very important factor of his thinking about politics was moral factor. And I think that is a real legacy of Willy Brandt. That is his heritage. We should speak about this new Ostpolitik, understanding and knowing and respecting these moral elements. And moral elements means that we cannot accept imperial activities of Russia. We cannot accept illegal annexation of Crimea, Donetsk and Lugansk by Russians. We cannot accept the violence used by Lukashenko in Belarus. We cannot accept these actions against rule of law in Hungary and Poland. We cannot accept everything what from such very fundamental point of moral values is unacceptable. And I think that is a real Willy Brandt message and legacy. The second, of course, is necessary to be realistic and pragmatic, because Willy Brandt and Egon Bahr were very pragmatic people, and they understood very correctly that pragmatism is not a weakness. The pragmatism in the politics, the pragmatism and compromise is a wisdom, is a signal of and symbol of wisdom. So I think it's necessary to understand that today in this part of the world, we have a very differentiated situation. We cannot put all these countries into one box or one pocket, because Russia is a one story, Ukraine is a different story, Belarus is a different story, Moldova as well, different story, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia, different stories, etc. So it's necessary to understand much better what is the situation and how we can work, how we can manage the situation on this very, very different and very special directions. Next point, we as Social Democrats, we should try to organize really European unity to manage this Ostpolitics. Because in my opinion, if Europe will be not united, will be not sure about own goals, own politics, we have no chances. Russia is enough strong and is enough smart and it has enough good diplomacy and can use a lot of so-called hybrid methods that they will win such competition when European Union or the West, broadly speaking, will be not strongly united. So one of the next tasks for us, as we want to be active on this new Ostpolitik, is to keep morality first, European unity second, differentiated approach to the many countries. And last point, which I want to offer is, and I think that is a real problem today. What was a real, let's say, surprise in this German Willy Brandt's Ostpolitik, that with the strong enemies, because Soviet Union was a strong enemy for the West, for the Germany, they decided to open the dialogue. Even if this dialogue at the very beginning was a dialogue of that and blind people, you know. But we need the dialogue again. We need the dialogue, and I think would be good if Social Democrats in EU will decide to find some, especially not only this official dialogue, but also through NGOs, through some unorthodox lines to keep the dialogue. And with this dialogue with the Ost, we have to keep on the two levels. The first level is civic society, because that is something what today is much stronger, much more visible, much more loud as 50 years ago during Willy Brandt time. So social democrats working closely with civic organizations, NGOs in Belarus, Ukraine, Poland, etc. That is something what we need very much. But the second element of this dialogue is much more complicated and much more risky, and sometimes much more difficult to explain to the public opinion in our own countries, is to open the dialogue with the leaders, with the leading forces. Of course, today, if some who will meet Lukashenko will be criticized very much in own country, okay, yes. But I think if we will have such dialogue, of course, based on this very strong moral and ethic values, what I mentioned before, we can have a chance to change something. We can have a chance to explain something. We can do something more positive. And I'm sure that this drop by drop, step by step dialogue can be also very helpful when one day the civic society will be ready to win the elections, will be ready to change the political situations in own countries. So finally, I have to say, Ostpolitik of Willy Brandt was great, was very courageous, but to some extent was easier, was not so complicated. This new Ostpolitik for social democrats today is much more complicated, but if we will have a good approach, we will have a good arguments and the good people for that, we can achieve also quite great and historical success. Thank you very much. Thank you for your attention. And I'm sorry that it was a little bit too long. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kwaśniewski, for your opening statement. My name is Pauline Tillman, and I have the pleasure to moderate this online discussion and to introduce our three following speakers who will give a response to Mr. Kwaśniewski's statement in a minute. First of all, there is Kati Piri, who is joining us today. She has been member of the European Parliament since 2014, and Mrs. Piri is vice chair of the Socialists and Democrats and member of the Committee on Foreign Affairs. She focused in the past few years mainly on the collaboration of the EU with Ukraine and also Turkey, so she will introduce a European perspective to our issue. Thank you for your participation, Mrs. Piri. And our second speaker is Liana. She's Program Director of International Affairs at the German Körber Foundation. By education, she's historian and political scientist with a focus on Russia and Eastern Europe. And she's right now working on a book which will be published in spring 2021 about Germany's role in European policy towards Russia. Thank you also for joining us, Mrs. Fix. And last but not least, Max Bergmann will give us a Washington, DC-based perspective. Mr. Bergmann is Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress and focuses on European security and US-Russian policy. And we all know with Joe Biden as new president, the transatlantic partnership will change. He will tell us more what might be a new perspective and consideration also of the historic Kniefall of Warsaw. Welcome to you too, Mr. Bergmann. So again, welcome to all of you. And Kati Piri, do you want to start with your European response to Mr. Kwaśniewski's opening statement?
Sure, and thank you very much also to President Kwaśniewski. I think you also gave, of course, a European perspective. And it's good to see that social democrats, it doesn't matter whether you're from Poland or from the Netherlands, we very much think alike along the same principles. And of course, I'm also very pleased for the organizers to host this event on such an important historic commemoration. A couple of words, of course, on the history and then on the future. When it comes to Willy Brandt's drop on the knees in front of the monument and the ghetto heroes in Warsaw, we all agree that this took courage. And for long, there was a speculation whether this was planned or whether it was spontaneous. But I think from the moment it happened, everyone could see that it was authentic and that it was historic. And as the Chancellor of Germany, he begged for the forgiveness of the crimes of the Nazi era and reconciliation also with the Polish people. And after the atrocious war fought on the European continent, and millions of Jews and others were killed. And Brandt, of course, did not only open up the way to normalization of relations, but not just between West Germany and Poland, but also between the East and the West. And today, 50 years later, we can safely say that Willy Brandt and of course Egon Bahr laid the groundwork for the European Union we now live in, as I think was also said by the presidents, where we live together in a democratic framework. And personally, as the daughter of a Hungarian refugee, of a man who was 16 when he fled Hungary in 1956, our conversation, of course, also has a strong personal dimension to me today. And I think it's clear that the enlargement between 2004 and 2007, which also included my country of origin, Hungary, is Willy Brandt's most tangible heritage. And these are all countries part of the European family today. Of course, that doesn't mean that there are no problems. And it's very, or perhaps it's not a coincidence that when we commemorate the 50th year of the Kniefall of Willy Brandt, we also have, as you know, this Thursday, European leaders deciding on a couple of the topics that we are also discussing here today. Let me just mention one of them. President Kwaśniewski already said it. There are, of course, also problems. This week that we will have the discussion on the Hungarian and the Polish veto on the EU's future budget and recovery fund. And I think that linking the benefits of EU membership, like European funds, to the respect for rule of law and democracy is, in my opinion, also a fundamental to the defense of our shared progressive values. And I think that also contains the main lesson for any new approaches to Ostpolitik. Any focus must be on the people. And regardless of the nature of the government in question, we must maintain, and where we can even strengthen, our ties with the population in various countries, be it in the Eastern Partnership, the Western Balkans, or certain European Union member countries. In the end, the people do not want very different things. As US President Kennedy said, even before Willy Brandt's Kniefall, let us not be blind by our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests, because wherever we are from, we all breathe the same air. It is the same approach that I believe we have to have towards our neighbors in the Eastern Partnership, to support their strive for democracy, human rights, and economic prosperity, and to support their fundamental right to elect their own leaders, but also to decide on their own future. The brave people of Belarus are now for months demonstrating for this very same right. And we should continue to stand on their side. And of course, we also have a special responsibility as European Union towards those countries in the Eastern Partnership with which we have signed an association agreement, Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova. It's their people who want us to have a closer relationship. Now, the big elephant in the room is clearly Russia. It is crystal clear that the Russian regime under President Putin has made a swing for the worse over the past decade, and in several cases, even enhancing its sway over the region, whether by supporting illiberal leaders, spreading disinformation, or engaging in hybrid or even open warfare and annexation. And we have seen the effect of so-called building bridges with Russia. Russia has not become any more democratic, liberal, and peace-seeking. On the contrary, just like in the case of Belarus, this strategy has only strengthened its authoritarian and oligarchic leadership, and therefore worsened also the situation for its own population and Europe at large. Now, does this mean we should not strive for dialogue? Of course, we must strive for a dialogue, but also, as President Kwaśniewski just said, a dialogue based on principles. We cannot be naive in this dialogue, and it must be based on our values, on our moral values, and having always also the population at the fore of our mind. And finally, we should continue to follow Willy Brandt's example of dealing with Eastern Europe, all the countries in the Eastern Partnership, as equal partners. But to make no mistake, our primary solidarity within our new Ostpolitik must always be with the people of these countries. And this requires a strong European Union that is ready to act in support of its values, but also together with international partner. And I'm pleased to see also Max Bergmann in this panel, because of course we trust that the US will again, after last month's presidential elections, be a partner when it comes to standing up for rule of law and democracy also in our neighborhood. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Piri. Liana Fix will dive into the German perspective in the next 5 minutes. So, Mrs. Fix, this is your stage.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone and to the organizers for organizing this event, for inviting me, especially to Maria Skora. I think it's an honor and a pleasure to be here, to speak here at the special event, and especially this topic that is so important from a German perspective, and also for me personally. As President Kwaśniewski said, I was certainly not yet born when this event happened, but it still defines the political identity of many Germans. And it also defined the political identity of myself when I was young. I still remember when we learned about Willy Brandt and the genuflection of Willy Brandt, how astonished I was back then when I learned how much criticism he received for this symbolic and important gesture at the time. And I think what we can learn from this is also that what is controversial at the present time can become consensus in the future, and to some extent even become part of a nation's identity, of a national identity, as this moment definitely has become part of Germany's national identity to some extent. I think the question today really is, what can we learn from this daring foreign policy of Willy Brandt, from his courage, from his political imagination? And I would like to focus on what I think Berlin can contribute to an Eastern policy, and what should be the framework conditions of this contributions. I will offer three points, and I think this will add nicely to what has already been said by Kati, Piri, and President Kwaśniewski. My first point would be to be ambitious, but not to be naive when it comes into Eastern policy, especially in relations with Russia. What we have witnessed this year is certainly a low point in relations between Russia and the West, or respectively Russia, Europe, and Germany. We had the poisoning of Alexei Navalny, especially from a Berlin perspective. We had the cyber attacks on the Bundestag. We also had the Tiergarten murder. This is a long list that has contributed to a deterioration in the relationship. And we also have a significant deterioration in the US-Russian relations, especially when it comes to arms control. So I think at this point, there's a fine line to walk between ambition and between naivete when we think about renewed engagement, outreach, or initiative towards Russia. Germany has been in the past the front runner in initiatives. If we think back, the Meseberg Initiative, the Modernization Partnership, also after the Ukraine conflict, engagement within the youth framework of selective engagement. So what we can definitely say that there's certainly no lack of goodwill, but there's also a growing understanding that Germany and the EU and Russia on the other side operate under very different assumptions and logics. And to open a new chapter is, to quote the description of this event, goodwill is not enough. So we need a mixture of dialogue, but also of leverage towards Russia to sort of negotiate the areas of engagement, but also the red lines in our relationship. And most importantly, any new engagement will also have to keep in mind the interest of our European partners. I think this is very much what was behind Heiko Maas' idea of a new Eastern policy, which should include engagement with EU Eastern neighbors, but also with countries, Eastern countries beyond the EU. For instance, at the Three Seas initiative, which was regarded a bit skeptical, Germany's role there. The concept was relatively broad, but the principal idea to work closely together with the Eastern neighbors within the European Union remains important. And I think to some extent we have also to be careful not to exhaust the term of a new Ostpolitik too much. It has such a positive historical reference, and for good reason it has this reference, but we have to be careful not to empty it if we don't have substantial political content and strategies to back this up, to back up a new progressive Eastern policy. My second point is, while the window of opportunity for a forward-looking, positive, constructive agenda with Russia might not yet be there, there is a responsibility to engage with our Eastern neighborhood. And I think Kati, Piri outlined this very clearly, first and foremost in Belarus. I think in this crisis, especially our friends from Lithuania really demonstrated the courage and the solidarity and the leadership in this crisis, which is very much in the spirit of Willy Brandt. And I was reminded of a quote, something he said in 1987, and I will translate it into English. He said that, if I have to say what is more important to me than everything else next to peace, then my answer is, without any ifs and buts, freedom. Freedom for the many and freedom not for the few, freedom of conscience and freedom of opinion, and to be free of misery and fear. And I think this is a very inspiring quote, especially if we look at the neighborhood and if we look at Belarus. And then, of course, we have to support Ukraine and Georgia to remain on the path of good governance and to strengthen democratic political processes. The conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh, I think, demonstrated very clearly that the EU plays not yet the role it wants to play in the Eastern neighborhood. All calls went to Moscow during this crisis. And it also reminds us that the EU needs a security dimension in its role in the neighborhood. So there's a lot of homework to do for the European Union, a lot of responsibility in the Eastern neighborhood. And I think this is one of the areas where Poland and Germany, despite disagreements in many other areas, can push forward a positive and constructive agenda that unites rather than divides. And then my third point, and that is something that is often overlooked, is that Willy Brandt's Ostpolitik was very firmly rooted in Germany's integration in the West. So it was never about equidistance or about loosening ties to the West, even if that was a reproach that he has received at the time. And I think that is also a lesson that we should always keep in mind. And President Kwaśniewski already said it, that our Eastern policy should always be anchored in our relationship with our neighbors in Europe and also in the United States, which is easier said than done when we have the sort of disagreements, especially with Poland or with Hungary about values, about the budget, and also at a time when the era of Trump has just come to an end. And I should probably also add that in some parts of German public opinion and in some parts of German society, the idea of equidistance or close relations with Russia is familiar. I will just quote our this year's survey results from our Berlin Pulse, which is an annual survey on German public opinion that we do each year. This year asked whether Germany should have closer relations with the United States or closer relations with Russia. We had 51% who opted for the United States, but also 25% who opted for Russia, and 16% that opted for equidistance. So there are some of these tendencies in German society. Just to sum this point up, engagement in any way works best from a position of cohesion and strength. And I think we have also seen this in Macron's initiative, which was very much an outreach towards Russia, how difficult it is if you are perceived as a solo actor in your initiative towards Russia. And I think now with, and this is perhaps a good opportunity to hand over to Max Bergmann, I think now with US President Biden, we may have perhaps the last chance really to refute Cassandra calls of a brain-dead NATO or doomed European Union. And I think this should to some extent also lead Germany to think even harder about projects such as Nord Stream 2, not only within the context of criticism about extraterritorial sanctions, but also within the context of Ukraine security and the interests and concerns of Eastern neighbors. And one last point that I would like to mention is that it's certainly also to some extent the task of our US friends to reestablish trust in US leadership and also to engage in a broad political dialogue with Europe, not least because we will have elections in Germany next year in September. So the era of Merkel, who really has been a cornerstone in relations with the East and in relations with Russia, is coming to an end. She was very crucial and fundamental in the whole Normandy process surrounding the Ukraine conflict. And then we will also have elections in France in 2022. So it's there are also changes in Europe coming. So to summarize, I think from my perspective, the three important points would be that you can always be ambitious, but you should never be naive, that it should be based on cohesion and strength within the European Union and with the United States, and that we should assume more responsibility for the neighborhood, as this is one of the areas where especially Germany and Poland can work together.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mrs. Fix. And Max Bergmann will share with us the American view on Willy Brandt's Kniefall in Warsaw and also what it means for today's Ostpolitik. Please, Max.
Well, first, let me just say thank you for having me. It's a real honor to be with such a distinguished group. You know, for me personally, this is a really significant moment. I'm the grandson of two Auschwitz survivors, as well as a grandson of a German family that had people serving in the military in World War II. And so the gesture, I think it's critical to put in, the gesture is one of strength, of reconciliation. I think really sort of set the course for Germany becoming actually the model for how to deal with a terrible historical legacy. And it's one where, you know, when I look at the United States in the last year and how we struggle to deal with our Confederate history, our history of slavery, Germany becomes a model. And it's a model because of reckoning with the legacy of what happened during World War II. And I think, you know, to put Willy Brandt's gesture in context, I think it's also a gesture of strength. And I think it's important to sort of, I think, in the context of Ostpolitik, to understand it as a gesture of strength. That by 1970, West Germany was rebuilt. The economy was quite strong. Democracy felt secure in Western Europe. The Cold War had frankly shifted out of Europe and was more focused in other parts of the world. And so this was an important point to sort of shift gears in terms of US and Western foreign policy towards the Soviet Union and communist bloc. And he recognized it, that there, you know, the hostility that sort of had permeated wasn't productive and wasn't resulting in any sort of change. The Prague Spring had happened 2 years before and had not resulted in change, but a massive crackdown. And I also think that the reality of him being a Berliner, of Willy Brandt seeing that Berlin was this sort of caged site, a caged city in West Berlin, but was one that was dependent on actually having relations with East Berlin and with East Germany, and that the good that then occurred was critical to ending the Cold War, as the president noted. That the exchanges that happened from West Germans and West Berliners being able to travel to the East to see relatives was actually critically important in sort of beginning to exchange information and demonstrating actually the strength of the West. I also think there's a moral dimension here, and this has been mentioned, is that Brandt didn't engage the East for economic gain. This wasn't about, you know, benefiting West German factories. This was about people-to-people exchanges, and it's in those interactions, I think, were really critical. And I think that those are some of the lessons I think we need to sort of pull forward as we think about, you know, where we are today. And I think the reality is that when we look at Russia today and we look at the West today, and particularly new Biden administration, is that right now we're not going to have very productive relations with Russia. And that the reason why is for some of the points that Liana mentioned, for the actions of the Kremlin. In particular, in the United States, we felt election interference particularly acutely, not just in 2016, but it's important to note that in this 2020 election, that there was a whole effort to basically slime the vice president's son, much of which had ties to Russian intelligence. And so we see a direct effort by Russia to play in the politics of the West. We also see an effort by the Russians to exploit, frankly, our financial laxities, the ability to launder money into our economic system, into real estate. And that has become a vital tool for Russian intelligence operatives. So I think when we think about Willy Brandt, I think we need to think about needing to strengthen ourselves, needing to look at our democracy. How do we increase transparency? How do we crack down on illicit finance? How do we monitor and regulate the social media space that has become sort of awash in propaganda? And how do we sort of protect our overall democracy and body politics? So I think step one is strengthening ourselves. And that also extends to the transatlantic relationship. And I think this is where a Biden administration will really come in and seek to build ties with Europe, build ties explicitly with the European Union, something that the US has oftentimes struggled to or resisted doing before. But I think there's a real recognition that we need to cooperate and work together, not just because it's in our interests, but also because our values align. And I think what we sort of increasingly see is a degree of ideological competition. It may not be the same as what we saw during the Cold War between communism and democratic capitalism, but it now sort of takes the form of authoritarianism, of illiberal governance versus the openness and liberal democracy of the West. And so I think it requires us sort of basing our foreign policy on our values. One of the things that I think that contrast between Willy Brandt and Richard Nixon, I think, is quite clear. Nixon also pursued détente with the Soviet Union, also pursued détente with the Chinese. Similar sort of openings occurred during the 1970s, but Nixon didn't sort of adhere to democratic values elsewhere in the world, with India, with the war between India and Pakistan, in Latin America with Chile. And the end result was a disaster, I think, for the West, a disaster for the United States, where our moral image declined greatly with great benefit to our adversaries. And so I think one of the lessons is that actually pursuing a policy rooted in values is critical. I think maybe a last point here is that I think how we confront Russia is also critical. That what Brandt showed is that engagement doesn't mean weakness, that engagement is an example of strength. And so I think it's critical that arms control and other areas where engagement is absolutely essential take place. But it also means confronting when red lines are crossed, if Russia takes action, such as murdering or assassinating a dissident in a Berlin park, then there needs to be consequences, that this is not acceptable. And so I think we're going to be entering a fairly rocky period in US-Russia relations in particular, because the United States is going to want to impose real costs on Russia for its actions, particularly over the last 4 years, since the perception here in the United States is no real costs have been placed on the Kremlin regime. And then as those costs are put into place, I think it's incumbent on the US and Europe, and particularly Germany, because when Germany leads on Russia, it leads Europe, to make transatlantic Russia policy not so much about economic relations. Sometimes engagement today is being discussed in terms of just economics, in terms of the profit that could go to certain companies by engaging with Russia. But we need to think about this more in terms of values. And so I think the people-to-people engagement that Willy Brandt ushered in was critical, and that needs to be a core part, I think, of future transatlantic engagement. That we can't lose sight of the Russian public, but also, the public of Ukraine, of Georgia, as others have mentioned. So maintaining those ties and connections is going to be critical. And maybe I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Max Bergmann. Thank you to all of you. This was really interesting. And we have right now approximately 30 minutes for the discussion. So if you do have any questions, please write them into the chat box, and our speakers are more than happy to answer them. And there was one question concerning Russia. As you mentioned, Russia, Bergmann, Mr. Bergmann, extendedly, I would like to ask a question from Mr. Fleckenstein to Mrs. Piri. As we all know, dialogue with Russia is something difficult to agree on in the EU. What measures do you suggest for the EU internally to find a common way? Although we have a very different history, we need it urgently. What would you respond, Mrs.
Well, it's true. Well, first of all, to Knut Fleckenstein, that we miss him, of course, in the European Parliament. He was a great colleague in the last mandate, and of course, happy to know he's part of this debate. Where I know he also worked extensively, also within the SPD and also within the European Parliament, to set up that dialogue. I don't think anyone is against the dialogue, but the question is, of course, what can we achieve right now with the dialogue when it comes to authorities? And this is where I go back to, yes, of course, we all have differences. Like I said, you can't erase the fact that my father was a refugee in '56 in Hungary. Hungary and Poland have, of course, also very different relationship than the country I grew up in the Netherlands, when it comes to Russia. But I think what we have in common, at least what we have as progressive, what we have as social democrats in common, that we have absolutely nothing against the Russian people. And this is where the people-to-people exchanges, this is where the possible, I always believe that visa-free travel is one of the fantastic things that is there to offer for the EU when it comes to really benefiting the people of a country and not so much benefiting the governments. I think we have dividing rules, not just on Russia, also, of course, very much on China. But the moment we talk about people-to-people exchanges, more engagement there is where we should be able to find a unity also inside the European Union.
Okay. Perhaps also to Mrs. Fix, we talked about the tense relationship between European Union and also the US and Russia, especially since the annexation of Crimea and the war in eastern Ukraine. What is your answer, Mrs. Fix, how this tension might be solved?
I honestly don't think this is something to be solved in the near term. I think this is something to be managed. Mm-hmm. There are some fundamental differences, especially when it comes to European security, when it comes to the neighborhood, when it comes to the acceptance of values that are, at least as long as Russia remains on the path that it is right now, cannot be solved in a certain way. The question is, how do you manage to live with each other in a way that does the least harm to our principles and to our priorities? And I think that is the fundamental question that is also was behind the selective engagement strategy of the European Union, where Kati, Piri can certainly say a lot more about it, but which is also the challenge that there are areas where you have to work together with Russia. And I would absolutely underline that arms control is crucial, and the extension of New START is something that improves the security of the whole world honestly and to some extent. But there are other areas where you cannot just say, okay, let's put this issue aside, especially not areas of where security conflicts play a role, Ukraine, and just move on. So I think managing a competition and to a certain extent a rivalry with Russia in the next years will be the greatest challenge, both for Germany and the European Union, and I think especially for Germany after the era of Merkel, because she really was someone who was respected as an interlocutor from the Russian side and who had both leverage within the European Union and leverage with Russia and with Moscow. She didn't always manage to push really all her priorities through. There were also a lot of setbacks when Germany tried to lead the European Union but was not successful. But in the Ukraine conflict, she demonstrated this leadership. So this I think will be, with a view to the next year after September, one of the greatest challenges.
Mr. Kwaśniewski, do you want to reply to the responses from Brussels, Berlin, and Washington?
Oh, I agree. Generally speaking, I agree with all these answers. I can say maybe once again that we need to have a really common approach, because you know, especially Putin's Russia is quite smart to play such game with 27+1 European politics. And it means that they have 27, of course, before it was 28, bilateral politics, and they have different approach to members of European Union, to some of them very privileged, for some of them very, let's say, frozen, like Poland, for example, today. And this +1 is a politics vis-a-vis Brussels. The Russians, they don't believe that European Union can exist, can survive. They are sure that the fate of European Union is the same as it was with Soviet Union. And I think the most important answer from our side is to be united. If European policy is not united, we have different approaches, we have some real weaknesses. Russia is enough strong to use it. And that's the problem, because if Europe will be not enough united, this dialogue, I fully agree. You know, one sentence is what one of my colleagues mentioned before is absolutely correct. We should be ambitious, but not naive in this Ostpolitik. So I think that should be even the title of our meeting today.
The vision is
be ambitious, but not naive. But one of this how to avoid this naivety is our unity, and that's the problem, because in my opinion, we are not united enough.
Yeah, and there's a tendency of fragmentation when we look at the
yes.
Brexit, for example. Mrs. Piri, how might a new progressive Ostpolitik succeed while there's less and less common ground?
I think you can say that in general, how can the European Union's foreign policy succeed when there's less and less common ground? I think if we would have had a debate on China, we would have had similar approaches. And
exactly.
This is really a matter of concern, to be honest, because this is also something where I believe European leaders are not always on the same line as European citizens. European citizens expect, and for a long time, if you look at all the barometers, is to have a common joint European foreign policy. And we see us being paralyzed more and more when it comes to our foreign policy because of the veto that certain capital countries are using by even having, joint statements. So I don't think this is just a challenge towards our policy with Russia. It's a challenge for the credibility of the European Union in the world stage, not just towards Russia, but also towards China and towards others. At least we are, yes, the United States as well. We saw some congratulating even the former president for winning this election inside the EU. And that happens to be the next president of the European Council as of June. So we have our challenges on this. But of course, this is not just a technical thing on how to do the votes. We also see, and this is where I was a bit more concerned when it comes, for instance, on Russia, on having, for instance, Paris having a very solo approach to deciding at a certain moment to change its policy towards Russia 180 degrees and going ahead alone. And then probably Berlin having, of course, more of a 10-year period of a certain relationship with Russia. And this is where I think at least the most countries of the European Union need to come together on these crucial questions, because I fully agree with what the president has said. Otherwise, Russia will play us apart. And this is, you know, you can't have an Ostpolitik if you are not united.
How might a new progressive Ostpolitik look like on behalf of the German government, Mrs. Fix?
I mean, I think an answer has already been given because that's what Heiko Maas actually proposed in exactly these terms. Apart from the progressive, he proposed a new Eastern policy. So this is what I alluded to before, the idea that we have to work closer together with our Eastern European neighbors within the European Union, but also engage more broadly with the Eastern Partnership neighbors. For instance, he took part in the Three Seas initiative. And as I said, this is an approach that is certainly very useful and that remains very useful to put the emphasis on a united approach towards Russia. But it is also a very broad concept, sort of, if you have three different directions in your Eastern policy, one is towards Russia, the other is towards the Eastern Partnership, which sort of works together. And then you have a third direction, which is within the European Union, an Eastern policy towards your own neighbors and your own member states. And I think that perhaps makes the concept a little bit broad or difficult to operationalize in the end and to make it clear in all details to the neighbors. So perhaps it's easier to separate a policy clearly in sort of beyond EU policy, which can be Russia and the Eastern Partnership, although obviously those are very different topics, even if interlinked, and then to think about coordination on Russia and the Eastern Partnership within the European Union in a different perspective, because Poland is obviously not anymore the East as it was perceived. It is sort of part of the European Union and part of Central Europe. So I would recommend this sort of differentiation within the European Union, and this was also something that was already to work together with Poland, and policy towards Russia was something that was tried already in 2010, if I'm not mistaken, under Donald Tusk, with some successes, and which is certainly more difficult under the circumstances right now, and also with the current leaders in Poland right now. But it's still, in principle, it's a very laudable effort.
Mr. Kwaśniewski, when I'm right, you think that the EU enlargement 16 years ago was a huge success. But do you think at the same time that the Eastern Partnership right now needs an update?
Well, first,
so long?
Yeah, it's okay, it's working. And first of all, thank you that you see us as a Central Europe. During my political career, I tried to explain that Poland is a Central Europe and not Eastern Europe. Of course, my successors, especially from right parties, they don't speak today that Poland is Central Europe. They speak that Poland is the heart of Europe. And that is a little bit too much, frankly speaking, because I think this position of Central European countries for us is enough. Well, enlargement was a great success. I think it was one of the historical decisions, the most important historical decisions of Europe, of European Union. Of course, I know that today, having such problems with the governments in Hungary and Poland, this opinion is can be a little bit different. But still, I'm sure that for the future of Europe, for the future of the world, such united Europe with so many countries, including Central European, Eastern European, Balkans, That is something what is absolutely great and will give us a lot of positive consequences in the future. Eastern Partnership, that is much more complicated, because Eastern Partnership from the very beginning was a program which is confronting us with Russia. Because Russia, maybe I will start from the very beginning. To understand this situation in Eastern Europe is necessary to understand the politics of Putin and his team. But I think even Putin will be replaced one day by some who this politics will be continued. Why? Because that is the politics with very, very deep historical background. That is not Soviet Union politics, that is also Tsarist politics, that is the politics of Russian Empire from the very beginning. Russia wants to have the zone of influence. And for them, some countries are the part of the zone of influence without the doubts, especially Ukraine, but also Belarus, but also Moldavia, but also Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia, and also Central Asia, all these countries, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, etc. Maybe Russia is not so much engaged to keep in the zone of influence Baltic states, because they are small, they are different, they have a different religions, languages, etc., etc. But for Putin and for his successors as well, this zone of influence will be one of the most strategic elements of this politics. And because of that, that is a problem, because Eastern policy, Eastern Partnership proposed, openly speaking, for all these post-Soviet countries, the countries from this zone of Russian influence, some alternative, that they can decide to be sovereign, to be free, and to participate in this Western integration, Western democracies as well. And of course, the main battle we have so long time about Ukraine, because Ukraine was the first country which decided to go much closer to the West and to our principles, to our values, and not to stay as a part of zone of Russian influence. I think we have a very, very soon strong conflict again concerning Moldova, because in Moldova with new president, Madam President, we have the same decision to go much more closer to the West. And because this Eastern Partnership was such a sensitive program, such connected with strong Russian interest, I think that is the reason why it looks how it looks. You know, that's today we can say that this program is in troubles. But in my opinion, if you speak about this new Ostpolitik with this new Eastern politics from our side, is necessary to continue this invitation for this country, maybe not so strongly, maybe not underlining that that is only such black-white alternative. You are with Russia or we are against Russia. I think it's necessary to say, okay, we can offer to these countries some soft programs of cooperation, especially support for civic society, for all these elements of democracy, but understanding that these countries will stay for much longer time in some kind of, let's say, unfortunately, I have to say so, Russian zone of influence. Simply speaking, you know, we have the situation in Belarus today. If you want to ask me, would it be okay to propose for Belarus today membership in European Union, I would say not. That is absolutely wrong. Today for Belarus is necessary to support all these movements and to say, okay, we are ready to help you to fight for sovereignty, for freedom, but we are not ready to change this geopolitical situation in the region, because it would be absolutely unacceptable for Russia, and it would create a lot of dramatic tensions in Belarus now. So we should be patient. You know, this politics should be should have long distance, but should be patient.
Mr. Bergmann, perhaps you would like to share your perspective with us concerning a new progressive Ostpolitik, and also what will change according to your point of view in terms of administration under Joe Biden.
Sure, thank you. I think the main thing that's going to change is, as I sort of alluded to, is an emphasis on values, an emphasis on that our democratic values are kind of what unite us as a transatlantic alliance. And so I think what we'll see is a United States that is actually very eager for Europe to act as one. And I think you may see U.S. foreign policy shift quite considerably, where we're going to want to encourage the EU to speak with one voice. Kati mentioned the difficulty oftentimes getting a statement out about the South China Sea or about Venezuela because a single European EU member may block that. I think you could see US influence, diplomatic leverage being devoted to encouraging states to sign on to joint common EU foreign policy initiatives. So I think there's going to be active US engagement, particularly with Poland, where if Poland is blocking something that we think is important on the EU level, Poland is a country where the US and Poland have very strong ties, and where the US frankly has a lot of leverage, particularly in the security space, given the strength of US-Polish military ties, the defense industrial relationship. And I think we should use the influence that we have as the United States, not to divide Europe, as Donald Trump was so frequently doing, but to push Europe to adopt a common EU approaches. And I think in doing that, that will give greater leverage in engaging with Russia and with the East. I think, so, you know, I think the problem of Poland and Hungary is, you know, flouting the rule of law is ultimately the EU needs to take greater action. I think the US can interrupt. And I think with Russia, you know, the first on the agenda is going to be administration. But I also think we have to sort of understand is that there isn't that much that the US and Russia, I think, can really gain from a broad-based interaction at this point. Economically, I think one of the big surprises of the 2014 sanctions for the United States was that the economic blowback actually wasn't severe for the US. And that doesn't necessarily mean that we should you know, uncork the sanctions and go at it again. But I think what it does mean is the US should feel strong enough that if there are Russian actions that we want to respond to, that we will have the ability to do so. But it's important that we do so not willy-nilly, as the Trump administration did on a few occasions, but to do so in coordination with our European partners. I think when it comes to Ukraine, I think that is a relationship where the US will be intensely engaged. The US has spent hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars to support Ukraine's military and security. And I think we will continue to push Ukraine on a path to reduce corruption and to adhere to democratic principles and the rule of law. And the same, I think, is true in Georgia. And I think that engagement will intensify. And while Russia may have a sphere of influence in things like NATO and EU membership may be a long way off, that doesn't mean that we need to necessarily respect that sphere of influence. And I think that's where the people-to-people engagement is going to be critical. And I also think that the US and Europe should look at trying to invest in media, and as we did during the Cold War with Radio Free Europe, the BBC, and other news items that were able to be received in the East. And I think ensuring that there is independent Russian media that is providing real takes on the regime is also going to be critical. And the US and Europe can support those efforts. So I think there's a lot that can be done. But I think we're going to be entering a period that is somewhat rocky in our relationship. And I think it's about continued engagement and dialogue with the Kremlin so that rocky engagement doesn't escalate. But it also means being confident in ourselves and our values and taking actions to make sure that our societies are strong, that our democracies are strong, and so that we can engage with a degree of confidence.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bergmann. We are a little bit running out of time. So we have like 5 minutes left. And there are some questions in the chat box by our attendees. So I just would like to pick up one question to Mrs. Piri. I shortened it a little bit. It was asked by Joseph, and he wanted to know why policies outside the EU seem to have been following rather consensually in recent years. There are tensions between EU member states in Central Eastern Europe and the West. So how should the current problem with the rule of law be addressed in the EU? What would you say?
Yes, we can do a separate seminar on this, but I'll try to be very short.
Answer it in 2 minutes.
Yes. Look, to give you an example, like I told you, my parents are from Hungary. My mother was in Hungary the moment we voted on this rule of law, on Article 7, starting the Article 7 procedure against Hungary 2 years ago. And when I called her up to tell her from the plenary that we managed to find a majority for the vote, her reply was, "That's very good, but years too late." This rule of law problem is not something that appeared today. We have seen it being built up over the last couple of years, and we have been too slow in responding. Too slow because we thought it started in Hungary, there'll be another government. We are in the middle of the financial crisis with Greece. We thought it's not a country of the Eurozone, and we let it be. And we saw actually, of course, what happened when also in Poland, the Kaczynski brothers came to power, and what's happening in countries like, for instance, Slovenia today, or Borisov in Bulgaria. If we fail in this budget for the next 7 years to have a rule of law conditionality, I'm very, very pessimistic about what this will mean for pro-European citizens, how they can, again, at least in my country, this will be the case, put their trust in pro-European parties if we continue to give actually money to autocrats in these countries, which does not appear in the pockets of the citizens who would actually need this money the most. So for me, this is not a matter of negotiation. And this is where I'm concerned very much about Angela Merkel, not about the SPD part of the government, but Merkel, who somehow has fixed in her head that she needs to find a compromise. Well, there are some things you just simply cannot compromise on, and rule of law is one of them, and our values are one of them. So I very much hope for a firm stand. Of course, I hope the government in Poland, I'm more optimistic about than the government in Hungary, especially because of what Max said, that I don't think, with the election of Biden, I don't think any government in Poland would want to be totally isolated, not just inside the EU, but also from the United States. But this is really time to show what this European Union is about and that we stand for our values. So no compromise on this. For once, I'm not in favor of compromising.
Okay. So the topic of our roundtable is 50 years Kniefall von Warschau. And I would like to use the very last 2-3 minutes for taking a look into the policy of Willy Brandt. And one of his main sentences was, "Dare more democracy." And Mr. Kwaśniewski, I would like to ask you, do you think that we in the European Union, for example, should nowadays also dare more democracy?
Yes, we have. I think the main legacy of Willy Brandt is to understand politics as a politics with very pragmatic approach, but not still remember about moral values, about the values as such, because I'm very much afraid that today the politics is much more technique and not so much this these values, this moral approach, ethic approach, etc. So I think, especially for progressive left, that is maybe the task. What we can do to give more moral elements to this very pragmatic and very technical politics what we have in the world now. I think Biden victory is helping us very much, no doubt, but that is not enough. That is not enough because we need such politics in our countries, and we have to find better communication with our voters, because our voters sometimes are so cynical as politicians, and I'm very much afraid. And in coming years, the voters can be more cynical as politicians, and it would be disaster.
Mrs. Fix, should we dare more democracy, as Willy Brandt proclaimed?
If Willy Brandt said it, then it's usually right. So there are not a lot of quotations with Willy Brandt that you cannot agree with. But I think it's an important point that Kati Piri just mentioned, and relating to what you said, Max, about the US leverage towards Europe, or the US leverage towards Poland, also when it comes to Europe and European issues. I think everyone would be incredibly thankful and delighted if Joe Biden could somehow solve the issue about the Corona Recovery Fund until the end of this week with Poland and Hungary. I think he would get a lot of friends in Europe for this.
Okay. Thank you very much to our panelists. I would like to talk with you forever, but we have to come to an end, unfortunately. Thank you to Aleksander Kwaśniewski, to Kati Piri, to Liana Fix, and to Max Bergmann. And thank you to all the participants for joining us today and for your questions. Thank you very much to the Progressive Center in Berlin and the FEPS, the Foundation for European Progressive Studies in Brussels, for organizing this online event. And thank you to the European Union, the European Parliament, for the financial support. The very last words come from Ania Szypek, who works as Director for Research and Training at FEPS and was born in Poland. So she has, of course, a special relationship to this country and also to the Kniefall of Warschau. So please, Mrs. Szypek, we are looking to hear some closing remarks from you.
Thank you very much. As my esteemed colleague from the PZ, Maria Skóra, with whom I had an absolute pleasure to put this event together at the very beginning, this moment is monumental, and it's very hard to illustrate all the different threads of the conversation that have already been mentioned. But I was not only born in Warsaw, I actually was raised next to the place where today's event that we commemorate has been taking place. This has always been part of my childhood, my upbringing, and always has been part of what has shaped me as a citizen and as a social democrat. I think Maria Skóra started with saying, we are looking back at legacy, but looking back at legacy means, of course, that in order to do it a justice, one needs to learn from that and one needs to pursue the new avenues. And I think what was striking in today's discussion is that the events from 50 years ago, every single speaker started with saying, this story is personal to me because. And I think that is an important part of what we are taking forward, with Willy Brandt being such an iconic and symbolic person. We are taking forward the lesson on how to be bold. I think President Kwaśniewski specifically talked about the bold gesture, but the gesture that was also pragmatic, the gesture that shows strength, but also is able to cope with complexity. I think Kati Piri especially talked about the complexity of the European Union, but also the points we cannot compromise about. And finally, the question of the moral, ethical dimension that should be a compass in any sort of a dialogue that should continue was a very important message of this panel that I definitely take away with. László Andor started this conversation by saying, look, this is Willy Brandt, this is what we commemorate him for. President Kwaśniewski looked back and said, look, this gesture was fundamental, was monumental, but we all, when it was taking place, not all of us knew about its meaning, its significance, how it would play bringing reconciliation, how it would play bringing stability. Nobody at that point could have foreseen 2004 and unification of Europe. But while Willy Brandt is celebrated so much for this gesture, for his action within the Socialist International, I think it's worth mentioning that Willy Brandt was the president of what back then was Confederation of Socialists and Social Democrats, and today is known as the Party of European Socialists, and was leading that when it was going for its first crucial election, first direct elections to the European Parliament in 1979. And the very famous quote of Willy Brandt, "Today more democracy," has already been used, but I would like to resort myself to a different one. Just back then, in 1979, standing at the rally of all the social democratic parties in Paris, he said, "Let us believe in hopes that have been entrusted in us." And I think that with the legacy of Willy Brandt, with what the gesture has taught us about the strength, but also being humble, about possibility of reaching out and trying to set a new path, with being pragmatic, but also being visionary, with engaging new generation like myself, who later on were able to grow under the leadership of people like President Kwaśniewski to be modern social democrats. I think that today, taking that into account of what should be the Ostpolitics, what we should envisage when we talk about relations with Russia, when we talk about the Eastern Partnership, I think we should recoin it to let's not disappoint the hopes that have been entrusted in us, because as speaker said, as Piri mentioned, it's all about the people. It's about life that is taking place all around us. It's about people daring to ask for a better future. And of course, being in the privileged position of being at the heart of the European politics, I think we have no other choice but the moral obligation, and we should have an enthusiasm to be able to deliver. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you.